Pollination of fruit trees is required to produce seeds with surrounding fruit. It is the process of moving pollen from the anther to the stigma, either in the same flower or in another flower. Some tree species, including many fruit trees, do not produce fruit from self-pollination. The pollination process requires a carrier for the pollen, which can be animal, wind, or human intervention. Cross-pollination produces seeds with a different genetic makeup from the parent plants. Such seeds may be created deliberately as part of a selective breeding program for fruit trees with desired attributes. Trees that are cross-pollinated are pollinated via an insect pollinator produce more fruit than trees with flowers that just self-pollinate. In fruit trees, bees are an essential part of the pollination process for the formation of fruit. Pollination of fruit trees around the world has been highly studied for hundreds of years. There is a lot of information known about fruit tree pollination from temperate climates, but very little information known about fruit tree pollination from tropical climates. Fruits from temperature climates include apples, pears, plums, peaches, cherries, berries, grapes, and nuts, which are considered dry fruits. Fruits from tropical climates include bananas, pineapples, papayas, passion fruit, avocado, mango, are members of the genus citrus. Apple. Most apples are self-incompatible, that is, they do not produce fruit when pollinated from a flower of the same tree or from another tree of the same cultivar, and must be cross-pollinated. A few are described as self-fertile and are capable of self-pollination, although even those tend to carry larger crops when cross-pollinated from a suitable pollinizer. A relatively small number of cultivars are triploid, meaning that they provide almost no viable pollen for themselves or other apple trees. Apples that can pollinate one another are grouped by the time they flower, so cross-pollinators are in bloom at the same time. Pollination management is an important component of apple culture. Before planting, it is important to arrange for pollinizers. Varieties of apple are crabapple that provide plentiful, viable and compatible pollen. Orchard blocks may alternate rows of compatible varieties, or may plant crabapple trees, or graft on limbs of crabapple. Some varieties produce very little pollen, or the pollen is sterile, so these are not good pollinizers. Good quality nurseries have pollinizer compatibility lists. Growers with old orchard blocks of single varieties sometimes provide bouquets of crabapple blossoms in drums or pails in the orchard for pollinizers. Home growers with a single tree and no other variety in the neighborhood can do the same on a smaller scale. During the bloom each season, commercial apple growers usually provide pollinators to carry the pollen. Honeybee hives are most commonly used in the United States, and arrangements may be made with a commercial beekeeper who supply hives for a fee. Honeybees of the genus Apis are the most common pollinator for apple trees, although members of the genera Andrena, Bombus, Halictus, and Osmia pollinate apple trees in the wild. In Japan, orchard bees are more commonly used, one species providing 80% of the apple pollination. According to Christopher O'Dowd, the red mason bee, Osmia rufa, is a much more efficient pollinator of orchard crops than the honeybee. Home growers may find these more acceptable in suburban locations because they do not sting. Some wild bees such as carpenter bees and other solitary bees may help. Bumblebee queens are sometimes present in orchards, but not usually in enough quantity to be significant pollinators. Yet another kind of bee cultivated for orchard pollination is the horn-faced bee. It is used in Japan, and increasingly in the US, because it is up to 100 times more efficient than the honeybee, a mere 600 horn-faced bees being required per hectare as opposed to tens of thousands of honeybees. Symptoms of inadequate pollination are small and misshapen apples, and slowness to ripen. The seeds can be counted to evaluate pollination. Well-pollinated apples have best quality and will have 7 to 10 seeds. Apples with fewer than 3 seeds will usually not mature and will drop from the trees in the early summer. Inadequate pollination can result from either a lack of pollinators or pollinizers, or from poor pollinating weather at bloom time. Multiple bee visits are usually required to deliver sufficient grains of pollen to accomplish complete pollination. Almonds. The blossoms of all California almond varieties are self-incompatible, requiring cross-pollination with other varieties to produce a crop. The single most important factor determining a good yield is pollination during the bloom period. More than 1 million colonies of honeybees are placed in California almond orchards at the beginning of the bloom period to pollinate the crop. California beekeepers alone cannot supply this critical need, which is why honeybees travel across the country to the San Joaquin Valley each year. Although the recommended number of hives per acre is 2 to 3, due to the high demand in conjunction with the reduced availability of commercial beehives, many almond growers have to make do with a lower hive density during pollination. These growers started using semiochemical formulations, like splat bloom, to compensate for the low hive density. Splat bloom manipulates the behavior of the bees, inciting them to spend more time foraging, and thus pollinating flowers in the almond orchard, not only close to the hive. Like apples, pears are self-incompatible and need to attract insects in order to be pollinated and produce fruit. One notable difference from apples is that pear blossoms are much less attractive to bees due to the pale coloring and light odor. Bees may abandon the pear blossoms to visit dandelions or a nearby apple orchard. The majority of pollinators of pear trees are honeybees, although pears are also visited by blowflies and hoverflies. A way to combat the low attraction of honeybees to pear blossoms is to use bee attractants to entice the bees to pollinate the flowers. Bee attractants may include pheromones that mimic the brood pheromone of the juvenile pheromone, or other attractants. There are also other methods for attracting honeybees to pear blossoms. One is saturation pollination, that is to stock so many bees that all area blossoms are worked regardless of the attractiveness to the bees. Another method is to delay the movement of the beehives into the orchards until there is about 30% bloom. The bees are moved into the orchard during the night and will usually visit the pear blossoms for a few hours until they discover the richer nectar. Sources. The recommended number of hives per acre is 1. Citrus. Many citrus cultivars are seedless and are produced parthenocarpically without pollination. Some cultivars may be capable of producing fruit either way, having seeds in the segments if pollinated, and no seeds if not. Citrus that requires pollination may be self-compatible. Thus pollen must be moved only a short distance from the anther to the stigma by a pollinator. Some citrus, such as Meyer lemons, are popular container plants. When these bloom indoors, they often suffer from blossom drop because no pollinators have access. Hand pollination by a human pollinator is a solution. A few citrus, including some tangelos and tangerines, are self-incompatible and require cross-pollination. Pollinizers must be planned when groves are planted. Managed honeybee hives at bloom time are often used to ensure adequate pollination.